The boxing community in Dallas is pretty small. Kids get to know each other pretty fast.
They was good kids. Flat out, simple, good kids, too good for this world.
Police received calls about shots fired.
Officers get to the park. A lot of people are scattering.
There is a young man lying on the ground with a bullet wound to his head.
Everybody who's present is a suspect.
It was a lot of rumors going around.
Obviously, there was conversations trying to devise a plan to get revenge.
They took their rumor and they ran with it.
I remember talking to my partner and saying, did he get the wrong guy?
It's April 25th, 2021, in DeSoto, Texas, a suburb of Dallas.
At around 6:22 p.m., police received calls about shots fired at Les Zeiger Park.
Patrol officers responded to that immediately. They get to the park. A lot of people are scattering. People are getting in cars and driving off.
There is a young man lying on the ground with a bullet wound to his head.
Police actually tried to do first aid. They were trying to apply pressure. They were trying to put a towel on his head. At one point, he actually tried to stand up.
The injured man is unable to identify himself.
He was very frantic, laying on the ground with blood coming out of his head. We quickly got our ambulance there and our paramedics. They loaded him up and went, and he was still alive.
By then, only a few witnesses remain.
The initial detectives arrive at the scene and try to get some information. Nobody was really talking. We had no idea who this individual was that was shot.
Investigators do learn the crowd had gathered to memorialize a different shooting victim.
They were at the park for a balloon release memorial for another young man, 19-year-old Cameron Collier.
The witnesses that patrol officers did talk to did want to give any information. They all kind of had the same line. I heard a pop and I thought it was a balloon. Then I looked around.
They looked and saw the victim on the ground, but they did not say that they knew who the perpetrator was.
I think it's they just didn't want to get involved, right? And I can understand that. It's frustrating, right, as a detective, but, you know, you get that. I went ahead and decided to go up to the hospital to try to decide if we could figure out who our victim was. I arrived at the hospital and I, went into the room and he was, lying on the hospital bed with gauze wrapped around his head. I could see where the bullet had entered his head. I could see he was on a ventilator. He was not responsive at all.
Meanwhile, news of the shooting and rumors about the victim's identity are spreading.
I was at my friend's house and someone called him and told him that Kobe had got shot. And at that moment, I was just calling Kobe, texting him like, hey, you good? I just heard you got shot. Like, what happened? Let me know where you at, stuff like that. So I ended up calling my mama. Victoria told me that it was a shooting that happened at the balloon release where Kobe was at, and somebody told her that he had been grazed. Bullet grazed his ear. I pretty much was pacing around a little bit trying to get my mind together. My child was just shot, So, first thing I could think of, I called my sister and told her what happened, and then I called 911.
The mother of the victim called into DeSoto and said, hey, I believe my son was the one that was shot at the park.
And so we had her come up to the hospital. That's one of the most difficult parts of my job, is being with, the loved ones and the friends of the victims, and having to have them go into a hospital room and make an identification. Miss Graham did come in. She did identify the individual that was on the gurney as her son.
And that's when we started piecing together that this was, in fact, Colby Graham.
And I saw him. I saw him laying in the bed, and he was hooked up to life support.
I was just, it's hard to explain. It really is. Like, somebody just punched me in my stomach when I saw him laying there. My heart just dropped to my stomach.
Colby Marquise Graham was born on January 6, 2001 in Dallas, Texas, one of 4 children.
He loved all his siblings. He played with them and he grew up with them. He was a real good kid. He liked to play, at the time he liked to play football. He liked to play basketball, and he was a video game fanatic. He loved playing video games.
Me and Kobe used to do everything together, literally everything. Like, wherever I went, he went. You see him, you see me, you see him, you see me again. Like, yeah, so we was live.
In 2012, when Colby was in 6th grade, the family moved south of Dallas to the suburb of Lancaster.
He went to Lancaster High School, and then after Lancaster High School, he went to Gateway Charter School.
Colby and his brother took up boxing and found a new friend group.
The boxing community in Dallas, especially on the African-American side, is pretty small. It's predominantly like a Latin or Mexican atmosphere, so, you know, that draw the people closer, and the African-American kids get to know each other pretty fast.
He was very selective of the friends he hung around with, and the ones he hung around with I knew, and they was pretty good kids, very well-mannered. I met some of the parents that the kids he hung around with. They were really good kids.
Colby bonded with one young boxer in particular, Cameron Collier.
Cameron was really cool, really witty, easy to be around. I think boxing became an outlet for Cam and like an extended family and something to look forward to. So he worked really hard.
Cameron was a very gifted boxer, and he took it upon himself to study techniques of the greats, including Errol Spence Jr., a world champion and DeSoto native.
He was a rising star in the boxing community. He was also involved in the Marines, and he was very active in the community. You just take a lot of pride in that because you think this young man's really gonna grow up and be something.
Cameron and Kobe, they did a lot together. You know, he used to come to the house and pick him up when he needed to go places and did a lot together. They was friends for like maybe 4 to 5 years.
By 2021, the boyhood friends were now young men, and their friendship was as strong as ever. But that spring, tragedy struck.
On April 22nd, 2021, Kobe suffered a tremendous loss when his friend Cameron Collier was killed in his vehicle.
Colby was devastated.
He was so hurt, really hurt. Like, I just got through talking to him. He wasn't the Kobe he had used to being. You know, he had changed. I started noticing a lot of depression. He was kind of moping around the house and acting different.
3 days later, Colby planned to attend a balloon release in honor of his friend.
Cam died on a Thursday. Balloon release was on that Sunday. So within them days, he kind of made his mind up that he was going to go. And originally, he wasn't going to go by himself. He was going to go with our cousin. Our cousin had something to do. He was just like, okay, cool, I'm just going by myself.
But hours later, Colby himself is the victim of a gunshot wound. He is on life support at a local hospital as his mother looks on in shock.
I looked at him, and like, wow, why? You know, it didn't make no sense to me. You know, seeing my son laying in that bed with those on that machine, like, it just didn't make sense. I didn't understand.
When we spoke with Colby's mom at the hospital, in my opinion, she was doing a really good job staying strong.
She was asking a lot of questions that I can remember, and I said, you know, we're working on it. I hugged her. I said, you know, we're going to find out who did this.
Detectives working the case are familiar with Cameron's shooting 3 days earlier.
There were similarities between, you know, Cameron's death and now Colby Graham's.
Not only are the two cases similar, Colby's name had come up in Cameron's case.
He was a person of interest in Cam's murder. We immediately started to say, okay, this is definitely related to Cameron's homicide.
After sustaining a gunshot wound to the head at a memorial for his friend, 20-year-old Colby Graham clings to life in a Texas hospital.
Colby is in critical condition, and his chances of survival look slim.
The initial investigation was on what we call an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So that's what we initially started working the case as, but we knew there's a good chance that Mr. Graham would pass. The bullet that was removed from Colby's head was a .380 caliber.
.380, it's not a rare round, but more people lean towards 9mm 40, something more common. .380 is kind of, I wouldn't say rare, but it's not as common as a 9 or 40.
Most witnesses fled the scene of the balloon release in honor of 19-year-old Cameron Collier. That leaves DeSoto police with only one potential lead.
Colby Graham has been shot in the head just days after Cameron Collier.
He initially was a person of interest in the Cameron case.
Investigators revisit the details of the case.
When detectives responded to the scene of Cameron's homicide, it was a car that had actually looked like it had veered off of the road and was actually spun around backwards in somebody's front yard. And they found Cameron unresponsive in the driver's seat. And the thing about that scene was it was about to start raining, so we knew that preserving the evidence at that time was key. So we actually had people start fingerprinting the car almost immediately, and we actually did develop a palm print.
Detectives interviewed Cameron's family that same day.
We found out from the family that Cameron likes to sell shirts at this particular shopping center.
His mother was kind of having a hard time financially, so he was trying to help his mom out. He was selling these t-shirts and people was buying them, like it had his name. He was doing real well with the t-shirts. You know, he was making a lot of money with the t-shirts.
We immediately went and canvassed that shopping center.
Investigators pulled video from a nail salon. They saw a young man approach Cameron's parked car and strike up a conversation.
We actually see the individual actually getting into the passenger side of his vehicle and then leaving from that shopping center. We don't know what actually transpired in the car, what conversation took place in the car, but it was almost immediately after they left that shopping center, they made one right-hand turn and Cameron was dead. Minutes later, he was dead. So we believe that the person in this photo is responsible for Cameron's death. We took that still shot photo of that individual to the family, and we were showing them to everybody, asking, who is this person?
But no one recognized him.
Nobody could pinpoint who did it.
His family was eager for justice, especially Cameron's brother, Norman.
As we were talking to him, you could tell he was kind of hanging on every word we said, really taking in what we were telling him, trying to gather as much information as we were giving him at the time.
Even though Norm was older than Cam treated Norm like the younger brother. And Norm went wherever Cam was at, Norm came. Always, all the time. So, you know, like if you lose your brother like that, it's like taking a portion of yourself away. You know what I mean? You couldn't even imagine.
We said, let us do our job. Let us work through this investigation. We are working nonstop to catch Cameron's killer, and we will, for sure, do everything in our power to get somebody in custody if we have the right information. We asked the family, okay, who does Cameron usually hang around? Who can tell us where he has been, what his daily routine is? And they all said, well, yeah, he hangs out with Gabe. Him and Gabe are inseparable.
Gabe Salinas is also at the home.
We showed that image to Gabe, and Gabe was the one who initially implicated Colby as saying, that guy right there in the image, I'm 99% sure is Colby. That's when we started looking into Colby. We started trying to do some research on him.
Investigators spoke to Colby.
We look at, alibis. Where was Colby at the time? Everything that Colby was telling us was indicative that he was not anywhere near Cameron Collier's murder.
And we were kind of getting the sense that Colby, based on his height, was not the individual in this surveillance footage. You could tell that the person who got into Cameron's car was much shorter than Colby.
So we had eliminated him pretty quickly as a suspect.
That's when we actually found out that he had been killed at the vigil.
On the day of Colby's shooting, investigators circle back to Gabe Salinas.
And so we wanted to bring him in to see if he could help, right? We still hadn't made an arrest in the Cameron Collier death. So because Gabriel Salinas had told us that he had felt that Colby Graham had killed Cameron Collier, we wanted to dive in to get more information about why Gabriel thought that.
But now, Gabe has little to say.
Despite claims of knowing that Colby was responsible for shooting Cameron, Gabriel claims he did not know who shot Colby.
We weren't getting the whole picture, and we can kind of tell that.
Gabe does admit to being at the balloon release.
And so Gabe becomes a suspect, of course, because everybody who's present at the vigil is a suspect. Those that are closer to Cameron are more likely suspects.
Investigators in DeSoto, Texas, are trying to untangle the motive behind two shootings. One that claimed the life of Cameron Collier, and a second that left Colby Graham on life support.
The April 25th shooting of Colby Graham could have been carried out in retaliation for the murder of Cameron Collier.
Investigators question Cameron's friend Gabe, who initially pointed the finger at Colby as being responsible for Cameron's death.
We did want to look at Gabe's phone to see if there's anything in there that would indicate that he was involved in the murder on the 22nd or the murder of that day. I do a lot of digital forensics with cell phones and that sort of thing. So I asked Mr. Salinas if we could take his cell phone and do a forensic analysis of it. And he agreed. So as I was taking his phone to our lab to do it at the police department, a text came across from an individual named Norman. And the text came across as with a heart symbol and solid ass N-word. And at that point, based on my experience, that was somebody who was happy about something, that this was a good deed had happened. And, so that concerned me.
Detectives recall that Cameron's brother's name is Norman, and they wonder if this text is from him.
I went into the contacts of Gabriel's phone and actually confirmed that it was Norman Collier's cell phone number that the text came from.
Investigators recall a detail from their interview with Norman following his brother's death.
So we had actually asked Cameron's family if he had any means of protection. Did he ever have a gun on himself to protect himself while doing these type of deals in the parking lots and stuff like that? And actually Norman said, yeah, he usually has my .380 on him as protection.
We knew Norman had access to a .380 handgun, a Glock, that he said him and his brother would carry from time to time. We knew the bullet that was removed from Colby's head was a .380 caliber.
When we pieced together that he had a .380, and we decided, okay, well, let's start looking into Norman. Obviously, we had the motive.
Norman and Cameron were very close. Norman was the older brother. Their father had passed away in 2012, and so they had grown up for a significant amount of time without their father.
We didn't want to go arrest Norman Collier unless we knew we were absolutely right. So we started putting surveillance on Norman. We started to do the other investigative things that we do when we start honing in on a real person of interest.
We started calling and say, hey, we need to talk to Norman. We started trying to get family members to help us talk with him. Once we kind of started leaning towards it being Norman, we found that it was harder and harder to actually get him in person.
On April 28th, investigators received new information about Cameron Collier's murder.
We were getting information from some neighbors that they may have captured an individual running across some yards on a couple doorbell cameras. When we got those videos, we saw that this individual was actually running to a certain particular house. He was wearing like a gray hoodie with some type of ripped jeans and I believe a red shirt underneath.
Then, investigators receive an ID on the palm print found in Cameron Collier's vehicle.
The lab comes back with an ID on the palm print. However, it doesn't belong to Kobe. The palm print comes back matching that of a 16-year-old with an extensive history of burglary named Justin Davis.
Based on some of the doorbell cameras, we saw that he ran specifically to this one house. And when we developed information, we learned that that house was actually the house of Justin Davis.
When police look up Justin Davis in the system, they see that he is wearing an ankle monitor connected to a different crime. But when they ping the monitor's location, they find that it's been disconnected or broken.
We did surveillance on his house. We went and spoke to his mother at their residence, searched the residence, looking for any kind of evidence. We couldn't locate Justin Davis.
"5 days after the murder of Cameron Collier, investigators have identified a suspect, 16-year-old Justin Davis.
We couldn't locate Justin Davis, so we made the decision to do a directive to apprehend on a national database. In case he does get handled by any law enforcement officials, they'll know that we need to speak with him.
If Justin Davis killed Cameron, it proves that Colby didn't.
I remember talking to my partner at the time, Detective Acosta, and saying, did Norman get the wrong guy, right? Is this, I'm sure hoping not. We were hoping that this was not a case of Norman Collier going out trying to get revenge for the death of his brother Cameron.
But Norman's recent social media posts amp up their suspicions.
Norman Collier was posting things that were very interesting to law enforcement. Colby Graham was in a coma, and Norman is actually posting kind of derogatory things towards him being a zombie and that you're not dead, but you're not alive, those kind of things, indicating that, yeah, you're like the Walking Dead, essentially.
He made mockeries. He posted zombies. My brother was a zombie. I thought he was hard body, why they lied. Just all type of stuff, like crazy stuff. And it's like, boy, you just stay here and shot my brother and you making Instagram posts? Like, this what we doing?
It was him basically saying that's what you get for messing with my brother, right? That's the way we took that post at that time.
Investigators are still unable to track Norman down for questioning. On April 28th, 3 days after Colby's shooting, investigators get another break.
We were actually told by another detective that he spoke to somebody from the Parks Department who happened to mention, hey, are you working that homicide that happened at the park? And he's like, well, there's video there. And we were shocked at that information. We immediately went over to the park and started extracting the video from the actual DVR. And when we brought it back, sure enough, it had captured the offense on camera.
When they watch it, they get a shock. They are able to clearly see footage of Kobe's shooter, and it's Norman Collier.
From what we can see on the video, we see that the vigil is going on. There's still people hanging around the park. Colby walks up kind of slow, and it almost seems like Norman was almost, in essence, stalking him, coming around a car, and As soon as they met close to each other in between two cars, he immediately pulled out a pistol from his left pocket, held it with his left hand, and fired a shot towards Colby in his head.
I remember the shock factor of Javier and I looking at each other as we recorded this murder on video, right?
After the shot rang out, people started to flee. They started getting cars, leaving. Not Norman.
Norman starts jumping around, obviously excited, obviously amped up, which is what we would see somebody who is, feels some sort of relief, right? That they have done something for lack of a better term, retaliation. You kill somebody close to me, now I'm going to take your life.
We felt that he, in his heart of hearts, absolutely felt that he had killed his brother's killer.
That's when we swore out the arrest warrant for the aggravated assault.
But that charge is about to change. Colby's family gets a grim update on his condition.
It was the 28th. They took him down and they did the brainwave. And the doctor called me around by 8 in the morning and told me what was going on. They told me I need to get there. When we got into the room, they still had him hooked up to the machine. And the nurse kind of did a demonstration on him to show that he was gone. That's when they clarified that he was considered brain dead.
The next day, Colby Graham passes away.
I just heard my mama's footsteps walking in my room. She was just like, he didn't make it. And I was just like, damn. Like, I didn't know what to say. Even now, still in shambles, like, my heart is broken.
That's when we were planning on, changing the charge to capital murder under Texas law. Because when you commit murder in retaliation for something else, it rises up to the level of capital murder, which in Texas is punishable by life without parole in prison or the death penalty.
After a week of bloodshed leaves two friends dead, DeSoto police are on the lookout for two murder suspects. 16-year-old Justin Davis and 22-year-old Norman Collier. On April 29th, police get a tip on Norman's location.
We learned that Norman was actually staying with some family friends.
We called Norman and asked him to come to the police department to speak with us.
At first, it appears that Norman is ready to cooperate. Investigators come at Norman hard.
We told him, you shot the wrong guy. The individual that you shot was not the person who killed Cameron. We never revealed who it was. Based on Justin Davis's age at the time, we couldn't reveal that to him.
The news is a shock to Norman.
To be told that you killed the wrong person, you've risked your entire life and you've gotten it wrong. I think it was devastating.
He, in so many words, indicated that he was responsible for the death of Colby, but never outright said it. He said that he wanted to apologize to the families for what had happened. He would never fully outright say the words, yes, I shot Colby Graham, but the guilt was weighing on him so heavy that he was saying other things. He also stated what he did with the gun that he used. He told me that the gun, he had given it to somebody and that we would never find it.
Norman acknowledged that he got rid of the gun, but he didn't say to whom. And I think Norman's thinking there was he didn't want to get anybody else in trouble, that he was responsible for the shooting, and that the gun was gone.
Norman is officially charged with murder.
Once I learned that Norman Collier was in custody on the capital murder warrant, we drove over to the Collier's residence to let them know where Norman was and what had taken place. And I remember having the conversation with Mrs. Collier. It was very tough for me because I felt here was a mother who had two sons. One had just been murdered a week before, and now we had just arrested her other son on a capital murder charge that if it had been prosecuted as such, would have meant life in prison without parole or the death penalty. And to have to tell that to a mother who had been through so much affected me. I've never had to do that before, and I felt really bad for for Mrs. Collier having to go through that.
Even with the arrest, the investigation continues.
When we talked to Norman in his interview, he indicated that he had given the gun to somebody and that we were never going to find it. Right, so we believe that the only person that he had a close connection with after that shooting who would have been the one to give the gun to was Gabe.
Investigators bring Gabe Salinas back for another interview.
That's when Gabe learned that the wrong person had been shot. He was extremely torn up. You can tell that it was weighing very heavily on him that these certain events took place in this manner, and that he never said it directly, but we knew he was involved.
With neither Gabe nor Norman giving details, investigators piece together what they believe led to Colby's death. It started when investigators first showed Gabe still shots from surveillance on the day of Cameron's death.
Whenever we showed that picture to Gabe and he told us that it was Colby Graham, Norman was sitting on the sofa 10 feet from him when he heard that name, Colby Graham. And obviously there was conversations that were had once law enforcement left between Gabe and Norman as to maybe trying to devise a plan to get revenge.
Over those next 3 days, there was a lot of social media chatter in the DeSoto area. There were people saying that they knew had killed Cameron Collier. They knew that it was somebody who was close to him. We did see Colby Graham's name come up several times as people saying, oh, this is the man who killed, Cameron Collier.
Colby knew of the rumors and reached out to Gabe before the balloon release.
He felt that his name had been put out there as being involved in the homicide, which is why he clarified, hey, can I come? We believe Norman and Gabe may have actually rode to the balloon release together, and there was actually conversation had based on the cell phone extractions that we got that was telling Colby from Gabe, yeah, you can come through. So obviously that information would have been instantly relayed to Norman. As law enforcement, we believe he was lured to the scene to try to get him there. He knew in his heart of hearts that he had nothing to do with it, so maybe he felt, yes, I want to clarify things. My name is out there, but I didn't do this. I'm here for Cameron. I'm here to celebrate Cameron's life. And to him, that was more important than trying to squash any rumors. He was there to support Cameron, and unfortunately, he paid for it with his life.
As the dust settles around Colby's case, investigators still have an outstanding warrant to serve.
Justin Davis, who is responsible for the death of Cameron Collier, is still on the run.
In the weeks following the murder of Cameron Collier, authorities in DeSoto, Texas, search for his suspected murderer, 16-year-old Justin Davis.
We had known that he was being monitored by juvenile probation using an ankle monitor, that he had removed that ankle monitor.
Finally, on May 12th, Justin Davis is located in the Pleasant Grove area of Dallas.
Justin confesses to shooting Cameron Collier in a random act of violence.
For whatever reason, he found himself armed in the streets and looking to rob somebody. And he robbed and killed a person who didn't deserve it at all.
Justin Davis at the time of the offense was a juvenile, but was later prosecuted and certified as an adult in this case and was sentenced to an actual considerable length of time to prison.
In March 2024, Norman Collier goes on trial for the murder of Colby Graham.
He ended up pleading guilty to the jury at the beginning of trial. It's what we call a slow plea, which means you're going to a jury trial acting like you're going to plead not guilty. But when you go in, you stand up in front of the jury like, as a defense attorney, ladies and gentlemen, my client's guilty. He did what he's accused of doing. But there's a lot of mitigating factors that I want you to hear, and why I'm going to ask you for a lot lesser sentence than what the state of Texas is offering as part of a plea bargain. And that's what happened in this case.
Norman entered a plea of guilty to the offense of murder. But in Texas, if a murder occurs under what's known as sudden passion, the range of punishment is reduced. And so the issue was whether or not this was a sudden passion murder.
Norman's attorney asserts that he is not a cold-blooded killer.
There was no evidence of him ever being convicted of any crime prior to this. And when I say any crime, I mean any crime. So Norman had zero experience with the criminal justice system. Norman played video games, frankly. He stayed in more than his brother, and he had worked some various odds and ends jobs and made contributions to his household, but he wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't somebody that I think if you passed on the street that you would feel any type of threat at all.
They argue that while at the memorial for his brother, Norman was overcome with grief and anger.
There was a release of the balloons that had occurred, and it's kind of the same thing that occurs when you're graveside at a funeral and you see a coffin lowered. Now, I think the emotions that you feel in that moment, there's a lot of finality to it. There's a lot of pain. And this was just several days after his brother's death. It's generally understood that the impact of death, particularly someone close to you, changes how you feel and act mentally.
But prosecutors point out that Norman Collier brought a gun to the memorial, suggesting premeditation.
They tried to say that he acted out of sudden passion. There's nothing sudden about it. Sudden is when you hear about it, you see it, you act upon it, whatever the case may be at that moment. You don't wait 3 to 4 days and then go with your move. That's not sudden.
It was already in his mind what he was gonna do to him. So, and he had the time to change his mind. He had the time. But he didn't.
Ultimately, the judge came to the decision to sentence Norman Collier to 22 years in prison.
I don't think Norman would have done what he did unless he actually believed that Colby had killed his brother. It's sad to me not only that he decided to take matters into his own hands, it's that he made a huge mistake and ended an innocent person's life for no reason.
It didn't make sense to me, you know, and it was so sad because this young man, you know, he lost his life too. And it was sad as well for him and his family. And him shooting my son was more so, he was hurting and he wanted another family to hurt. So basically, hurt people hurt other people.
It's a lesson on decisions and will. We all given a will to do wrong, do right. So a lot of times when times are like kind of hard, you got to just stick with it, stick with the things that you know are right, because just things to just take a nosedive that easy. Just one little bad decision can just ruin the rest of your life.
They was good kids. Flat out, simple. Good kids. Didn't deserve it. Too good for this world. They both were. Life would have been a whole lot different than the way it is now. I'm gonna say that.
The woods behind Robin Hood Hills did not look like the kind of place where nightmares were born. In the fading light of early May, The trees stood motionless above shallow water and tangled brush, while dragonflies drifted lazily over the muddy banks. To the people living in West Memphis, Arkansas, it was simply another patch of neglected woods at the edge of a struggling town. Kids rode their bikes there. Teenagers hid there to smoke cigarettes. Adults warned their children not to wander too far into it after dark, not because they feared evil, but because the swampy ground could swallow a shoe whole if you stepped carelessly enough. On the evening of May 5, 1993, 3 little boys disappeared into those woods and never came home. By sunrise, the town would begin tearing itself apart. Before the week ended, whispers of Satanism would move through churches, police stations, school hallways, and television screens like poison drifting through water. And before the year was over, 3 teenagers would be branded monsters in one of the most controversial murder cases America had ever seen. But on that first night, before the headlines and documentaries and courtroom battles, there were only parents standing under porch lights calling their sons' names into the dark. The sound carried across quiet streets lined with small houses and chain-link fences. Stevie. Michael. Christopher. Again and again, their voices echoed into the humid Arkansas night, growing more frantic each hour. Somewhere nearby, dogs barked in the distance. A television flickered behind an open window. A train groaned through the edge of town. Life continued moving while panic slowly tightened its grip around West Memphis. The boys had been seen earlier that evening riding bicycles together, laughing as they headed toward the woods near Robin Hood Hills. They were 8 years old. Old enough to feel brave. Young enough to believe they would always make it home before dark. Nobody could have imagined that their disappearance would ignite a chain of events so disturbing, so emotionally charged, that decades later people would still argue over what truly happened in those woods. Because this story is not only about murder. It is about fear. It is about a community desperate for answers and willing to believe almost anything to get them. It is about how rumors can become evidence in the minds of frightened people. And most of all, it is about 3 dead children whose names were eventually buried beneath a storm of accusations, conspiracy theories, courtroom drama, and national media obsession. In the years that followed, the case would divide America into bitter camps. Some believed the 3 teenagers arrested for the murders were cold-blooded killers hiding behind black clothes and heavy metal music. Others believed they were innocent victims sacrificed to a justice system infected by paranoia and moral panic. The case would inspire documentaries, books, protests, celebrity campaigns, and endless debates. Evidence would be re-examined. Witnesses would change their stories. Families would turn against one another. Entire lives would disappear into prison cells while the question remained painfully unresolved: who killed the children of Robin Hood Hills? To understand why this case still haunts people more than 30 years later, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the trials. Not to the confessions. Not even to the discovery of the bodies. You have to begin with the atmosphere hanging over America in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when fear itself became a kind of epidemic. Across the country, parents were being told that satanic cults lurked beneath ordinary suburban life. Television talk shows warned audiences about hidden symbols and secret rituals. Churches played tapes describing devil worshippers corrupting children through music and games. Police departments held seminars teaching officers how to identify occult activity. In small conservative towns, suspicion spread easily. Teenagers who wore black clothing or listened to metal bands became objects of concern. Books about witchcraft, horror movies, even certain hairstyles could trigger rumors. Looking different was enough to make people afraid of you. West Memphis was exactly the kind of town where those fears could thrive. Sitting just across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee, it was a place struggling with poverty, crime, and hopelessness. Factories closed. Jobs disappeared. Many families lived paycheck to paycheck. Some neighborhoods looked exhausted, as if the buildings themselves were tired of surviving. People locked their doors early. Parents worried constantly about drugs, gangs, violence, and the slow decay swallowing the town around them. Religion played a powerful role in everyday life, and many residents believed strongly in the existence of literal evil. Not metaphorical evil. Real evil. Satan. Demons. Possession. By the spring of 1993, those fears were already simmering beneath the surface. Then 3 children vanished. Panic does strange things to people. It sharpens every rumor until it feels like truth. It transforms coincidence into certainty. It creates villains long before evidence exists. And in West Memphis, fear found its perfect target in a teenager named Damien Eccles. Long before police officially charged anyone, Damien already looked guilty to many people in town. He dressed in black trench coats despite the southern heat. He read books about the occult. He listened to Metallica and Iron Maiden. He spoke openly about religion and magic in ways that frightened conservative adults. Teachers viewed him as troubled. Neighbors described him as strange. Police officers already knew his name. In another place, he might have been dismissed as an eccentric teenager searching for identity. In West Memphis, he became something much darker in the imagination of the public. But Damien was only one part of the story. There was also Jason Baldwin, quiet and fiercely loyal to his friends, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., a teenager with limited intellectual abilities who desperately wanted acceptance from the people around him. Together, the 3 boys would eventually become known around the world as the West Memphis 3. Yet before the arrests and cameras and courtroom sketches, they were just teenagers wandering through a poor Arkansas town while adults around them searched for someone to blame. On the night the boys disappeared, the atmosphere in West Memphis shifted hour by hour from concern into terror. Parents joined search parties carrying flashlights through drainage ditches and wooded trails. Police cruisers rolled slowly through neighborhoods while officers questioned anyone who might have seen the children. The humidity clung heavily to the air. Mosquitoes swarmed around flashlight beams. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, water moved softly through the ditch at Robin Hood Hills. Nobody searching that night understood how close they were to horror. And nobody realized that the investigation about to unfold would become one of the most criticized murder cases in American history. The following afternoon, a juvenile probation officer named Steve Jones entered the woods near Robin Hood Hills after hearing reports that children's bicycles had been discovered nearby. The scene he encountered would remain burned into his memory forever. In muddy water beneath tangled branches lay the naked bodies of 3 little boys. Their wrists and ankles had been tied together with shoelaces. Their skin appeared pale beneath the dirty water. One child showed horrifying injuries that investigators immediately struggled to explain. News spread across West Memphis almost instantly. Mothers pulled children inside their homes. Fathers stood in silence staring at television broadcasts. Church parking lots filled with worried families praying together beneath dim evening lights. Reporters descended on the town searching for details. Police promised swift justice. The pressure to solve the murders became overwhelming almost immediately. But pressure is dangerous in an investigation. Especially when fear already controls the room. Detectives began searching not only for evidence, but for meaning. Why would anyone murder children this way? Why were they bound? Why had one victim suffered such severe injuries? In the absence of clear answers, speculation flooded the gaps. Some investigators became convinced the murders carried signs of occult ritual. Rumors spread that the killings were connected to Satan worship. Suddenly, every local teenager who listened to heavy metal or dressed differently came under suspicion. Conversations about evidence blurred into conversations about morality, religion, and appearances. The line between investigation and hysteria began disappearing. Then came the confession. Months after the murders, police interrogated Jesse Miskelly Jr. for hours. By the end of the questioning, Jesse confessed to participating in the killings alongside Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin. To investigators, it seemed like the breakthrough they desperately needed. But almost immediately, cracks appeared in the story. Jesse's statements contained contradictions about timelines and details of the crime scene. Parts of his confession conflicted with known evidence. Only fragments of the lengthy interrogation were recorded. And Jesse himself soon recanted, insisting he had been pressured into confessing. It would become one of the most debated confessions in modern criminal history. Still, for much of the public, The confession was enough. 3 suspects had been identified. The nightmare suddenly had faces. Yet even during the trials that followed, uncomfortable questions refused to disappear. Why was there no physical evidence directly connecting the teenagers to the murders? Why did so much of the prosecution's case rely on claims about Satanism and personality rather than forensic proof? Why did investigators seem more interested in Damien Eccles' black clothing and interest in the occult than in hard evidence from the scene itself? As the years passed, those questions only grew louder. New forensic testing failed to link the accused teenagers to the crime scene. Documentary filmmakers uncovered inconsistencies in the investigation. Legal experts criticized the handling of evidence and interrogation methods. Celebrities and activists joined campaigns demanding new trials. What began as a local murder case transformed into an international symbol of possible wrongful conviction. Yet through all the arguments, one fact remained painfully unchanged. 3 children were dead. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, Christopher Bias. Their final moments remained hidden somewhere inside the shadows of Robin Hood Hills, while the world argued endlessly about who deserved blame. And perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling. Most true crime stories eventually settle into certainty. Evidence becomes clear. Motives emerge. The truth hardens into something solid. But the West Memphis 3 case never truly settled. Even now, decades later, it feels unfinished, like a wound that never fully closed. Depending on who you ask, the story is either a terrifying example of teenage killers hiding in plain sight or a devastating portrait of a justice system corrupted by fear and prejudice. Some believe the wrong men went to prison while the real killer walked free. Others believe the original convictions were justified despite the controversy. The arguments have lasted longer than the childhoods the victims were allowed to live. And at the center of it all are those woods behind Robin Hood Hills. Quiet. Overgrown. Ordinary. The kind of place people drive past without noticing. But on certain evenings, when the light begins fading through the trees and the water beneath the brush turns dark as ink, it becomes easier to understand why this story still grips the American imagination. Because somewhere between fear and truth, between justice and hysteria, between memory and myth, the shadows of West Memphis are still waiting. In 1993, West Memphis, Arkansas existed in the shadow of something larger than itself. Across the Mississippi River stood Memphis, Tennessee, glowing with neon signs, music history, traffic, and movement, while West Memphis felt like the quieter, rougher cousin left behind on the opposite bank. The city carried the exhaustion of a working-class town that had been fighting decline for years. Freight trucks rumbled endlessly along Interstate 40. Rust-stained old industrial buildings near the highway. Cheap motels flickered beneath buzzing signs that attracted drifters passing through town for a single night before disappearing again by morning. Some neighborhoods looked forgotten by time entirely, with sagging porches, overgrown yards, and chain-link fences patched together so many times they resembled scars stretched across the earth. The town was not enormous, but it felt boxed in by poverty and routine. People knew each other's business. Rumors traveled quickly. Reputation mattered. Church attendance mattered. Family names mattered. And if you were considered strange, people noticed immediately. During the day, the streets carried the slow rhythm of southern small-town life. Pickup trucks rolled past convenience stores where men in work boots stood smoking beside gas pumps. Children rode bicycles through neighborhoods until the streetlights flickered on. Mothers called kids home from porches while televisions glowed through open windows in the humid evening air. But beneath the surface of ordinary life sat a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Crime rates were high compared to surrounding communities. Drug use worried parents. Gang violence from nearby Memphis sometimes spilled across the river. Many residents felt trapped financially, emotionally, and spiritually. Some families had lived there for generations and watched opportunities disappear year after year. Others simply wanted to survive long enough to get out. In places like West Memphis, fear often became part of the local culture. Fear of outsiders. Fear of violence. Fear of losing control over children growing up in a changing world. By the early 1990s, America itself seemed infected with paranoia. News programs warned parents about hidden dangers lurking behind ordinary suburban life. Stories about ritual abuse and satanic cults flooded television talk shows, churches, and police seminars. Across the country, investigators claimed secret networks of devil worshippers were abusing children through underground ceremonies and human sacrifice. Most of these claims were never proven, but that hardly mattered. The panic spread faster than facts ever could. In deeply religious communities, those fears blended easily into everyday conversations. Parents searched bedrooms for strange symbols. Pastors warned congregations about heavy metal music. Teenagers wearing black clothing or reading occult books became subjects of suspicion. Even fantasy games and horror movies could spark concern among adults convinced that evil was infiltrating American youth. West Memphis absorbed those fears completely. On Sundays, church parking lots overflowed with families dressed in pressed shirts and polished shoes. Sermons about sin and salvation carried enormous weight in the community. Many residents believed the devil was not symbolic, but real and active in the world around them. To them, Satanism was not an exaggerated media trend. It was a genuine threat hiding behind modern culture. That atmosphere would become crucial after the murders, because when tragedy struck, the town was already psychologically prepared to believe almost anything. Long before police made arrests, the idea of occult involvement felt believable to many people simply because they had already been taught to expect it. And in a town searching desperately for answers, expectation can become more powerful than evidence. Robin Hood Hills sat near the northern side of West Memphis, a wooded area tucked behind a residential neighborhood. To outsiders, calling it the woods might sound misleading. It was not some vast untouched forest stretching for miles. It was a rough patch of trees and muddy terrain crossed by drainage ditches and shallow water channels. Children treated it like an adventure ground. Adults viewed it as a nuisance. In the daytime, sunlight filtered weakly through tangled branches onto muddy trails littered with beer cans and broken glass. At night, the place changed completely. Frogs croaked from stagnant water. Mosquitoes swarmed thick in the humid darkness. The woods swallowed sound strangely, making distant voices seem closer than they were. Teenagers occasionally gathered there to drink, smoke marijuana, or escape adults for a few hours. Parents warned children to stay away after sunset, though many ignored the warnings anyway. The area sat close enough to neighborhoods that kids could bike there within minutes, yet isolated enough to feel secretive and wild. It was exactly the kind of place where childhood imagination mixed with genuine danger. The spring of 1993 arrived heavy with southern heat earlier than usual. By May, the air already clung damply to skin. Rainstorms rolled across Arkansas regularly, leaving ditches swollen with muddy water. The evenings smelled of wet grass, asphalt, and river humidity drifting across town. On the surface, life in West Memphis continued as normal. Schools prepared for summer break. Families argued about bills and homework and dinner plans. Children raced bicycles through quiet streets without realizing how fragile ordinary life really was. At the center of this story were 3 8-year-old boys who represented the innocence of that ordinary world. Stevie Branch was energetic and fearless, the kind of child who rarely slowed down long enough for adults to keep up with him. He had bright eyes and endless curiosity. Teachers described him as playful and stubborn in equal measure. He loved riding his bike through the neighborhood with his friends, chasing adventure wherever he could find it. Michael Moore was quieter, thoughtful in ways unusual for his age. He smiled easily but often observed before speaking. Family members remembered his gentle personality and the way he seemed happiest when surrounded by people he trusted. Christopher Bias was intense and emotional, full of restless energy that sometimes made adults shake their heads in exhaustion. He loved attention, loved jokes, loved proving he was brave. The 3 boys spent countless afternoons together exploring the neighborhood like children everywhere do when the world still feels safe. Their families were imperfect, like most families in struggling towns. Some parents battled financial stress. Some relationships carried tension beneath the surface. But all 3 boys were deeply loved. That fact often gets lost beneath the mythology surrounding the case. Before the documentaries and legal debates and conspiracy theories, there were simply parents raising children the best they could in a difficult town. Meanwhile, on another side of West Memphis, 3 teenagers drifted through lives that already felt unstable long before police ever connected them to murder. Damien Echols stood out immediately wherever he went. Thin, pale, and intense, he carried himself with a kind of restless anger that unsettled adults. He wore black clothing almost constantly despite the Arkansas heat. His dark hair framed sharp features that seemed older than his years. Teachers and police officers often described him as intelligent but deeply troubled. He had spent time in psychiatric facilities and spoke openly about depression, violence, and occult beliefs. To conservative adults in West Memphis, Damien looked like the physical embodiment of everything they feared about modern youth culture. Yet people who knew him personally often described a different side. They saw a teenager fascinated by philosophy, religion, and fantasy literature, someone desperate to escape the limitations of the town around him. He talked about magic and spirituality partly because it shocked people, but also because he genuinely searched for meaning somewhere beyond the poverty and hopelessness surrounding him. Jason Baldwin, Damien's closest friend, seemed almost opposite in personality. Blonde, quieter, and less confrontational, Jason came from a working-class family and spent much of his time skating, listening to music, and trying to survive adolescence in a town that offered little opportunity. Friends described him as loyal almost to a fault. He admired Damien's confidence and intelligence, perhaps because Jason himself often seemed uncertain where he belonged. Unlike Damien, Jason did not aggressively seek attention, but his friendship alone would eventually place him at the center of catastrophe. Then there was Jesse Miskelly Jr. Jesse struggled academically from an early age and possessed limited intellectual functioning. He wanted desperately to fit in and often tried too hard to impress others. People around town knew him as polite, eager to please, and easily influenced. He spent much of his youth doing manual labor, helping his father, and drifting between social groups without fully belonging anywhere. He was not considered dangerous by most who knew him. If anything, many viewed him as vulnerable. None of these teenagers could possibly understand that within months their names would become internationally infamous. In early 1993, they were simply young men trapped in a town that judged outsiders harshly and forgave very little. West Memphis itself operated almost like a pressure cooker. Economic hardship, religious conservatism, social frustration, and cultural fear all pressed together beneath the surface. Adults worried their children were growing up in a world they no longer recognized. Music became louder. Movies became darker. Teenagers challenged authority more openly than previous generations. National conversations about morality dominated television and radio. Every disturbing crime reported in the media seemed to reinforce the belief that society was collapsing spiritually. When communities experience that kind of collective anxiety, they begin searching for symbols to explain their fears. In West Memphis, Damien Echols became one of those symbols long before any evidence tied him to murder. Police already knew his name through previous minor encounters. Mental health professionals had documented his instability. Local gossip painted him as dangerous because he talked differently, dressed differently, and openly rejected social norms. Some residents claimed he drank blood. Others whispered about animal sacrifice and black magic. Most of those stories were exaggerations or outright fabrications, but once rumors begin feeding community fear, they evolve rapidly. People stop asking whether something is true and start asking whether it feels true. That distinction would eventually shape the entire investigation. Looking back decades later, what becomes most disturbing about the setting surrounding this case is how inevitable the coming explosion almost feels. All the ingredients already existed before the murders even happened. A frightened town. A horrific crime. Social paranoia. Religious panic. Troubled teenagers who looked frightening enough to fit the public imagination of evil. The atmosphere itself seemed primed for disaster. Yet on the surface, daily life continued moving quietly toward May 5th. Children laughed on bicycles. Teenagers argued about music and girlfriends. Parents worked overtime shifts and worried about bills. Nobody realized how suddenly ordinary life could collapse into something darker. In later years, many residents would remember small details about that spring with painful clarity. The smell of rain on pavement. The sound of cicadas after sunset. The sight of children playing outside beneath fading daylight. Memory works strangely after tragedy. Mundane moments begin glowing with terrible significance because they happened just before everything changed. And in West Memphis, everything was about to change forever. By the evening of May 5, 1993, the town still believed it understood itself. Families trusted neighbors. Police believed they knew how to identify dangerous people. Churches believed evil could be recognized by appearance and behavior. Parents believed children could still safely ride bikes through familiar streets. Within 24 hours, those assumptions would begin unraveling one by one. The murders of 3 little boys would not only shatter families. They would expose the deepest fears, prejudices, and weaknesses hiding beneath the surface of an entire community. And once those fears escaped into the open, nobody in West Memphis would remain untouched by them. Before the murders turned their names into headlines, before courtroom sketches and television documentaries reduced them to symbols inside a national argument, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Bias were simply children living ordinary lives in a struggling Arkansas town. They were boys with scraped knees and grass stains on their jeans. Boys who raced bicycles through puddles after rainstorms and came home sweaty from the southern heat. Boys whose worlds were still small enough to revolve around cartoons, schoolyards, and whichever friend's house had the best snacks after class. The tragedy of the West Memphis case often becomes buried beneath legal controversy, but at the center of everything were 3 8-year-old children who never had the chance to grow older. To understand the horror of what happened in Robin Hood Hills, you first have to understand who these boys were while they were still alive. West Memphis in 1993 was the kind of place where childhood unfolded outdoors. Kids disappeared from their homes in the afternoon and returned only when porch lights flickered on after sunset. Parents worried, of course, but many still believed neighborhoods could raise children collectively. Neighbors watched from windows. Older siblings kept loose track of younger ones. Bicycles became freedom itself. To an 8-year-old boy, a bike meant escape from adults, homework, and routine. It meant independence. The 3 boys spent much of their time riding together through the streets near their homes, moving between neighborhoods, drainage ditches, and wooded areas like explorers convinced the world belonged to them. Stevie Branch carried a kind of restless energy that made him impossible to ignore. Thin and bright-eyed, he moved quickly through life, often speaking before thinking and running before looking. Adults who knew him sometimes smiled with exhausted affection when describing him because Stevie seemed permanently in motion. He climbed fences he had been warned not to climb. He wandered farther than he was supposed to. He challenged rules simply because they existed. Yet beneath that stubbornness lived a child deeply attached to the people he loved. Stevie craved attention and affection constantly. He wanted to be included in everything. Friends remembered him as fearless in the careless way children often are before they fully understand danger. If another child hesitated before jumping a ditch or entering the woods after dark, Stevie would usually go first. His confidence pulled others along behind him. At home, Stevie's life reflected the instability common in many struggling families. His mother, Pam Hicks, loved him fiercely, but life was not always easy. Financial problems weighed heavily on households throughout West Memphis, and relationships inside the family carried tension that children often sensed even when adults tried hiding it. Still, Stevie remained the emotional center of the home. He laughed loudly, argued loudly, cried loudly. His presence filled rooms completely. The silence left behind after his disappearance would later feel unbearable to those who knew him. Michael Moore seemed older than his age in certain ways. He had softer features and a calmer personality than Stevie, often observing situations quietly before speaking. Teachers remembered him as polite and thoughtful. Friends described him as loyal, the kind of child who preferred staying close to familiar people rather than seeking attention. Michael loved spending time with his friends but lacked Stevie's impulsive recklessness. He followed along more cautiously, sometimes acting as the quieter balance within the group. His smile came easily, though he was not naturally loud or disruptive. Family members remembered small details that later became emotionally devastating to recall. The way Michael carefully lined up his toys. The way he liked sitting close beside adults while watching television. The way he looked over his shoulder before crossing streets because he had actually listened when people taught him to be careful. Compared to the chaos surrounding other households in the neighborhood, Michael's home life appeared more stable from the outside. Yet, like every family touched by this case, his loved ones carried invisible struggles and pressures beneath daily routine. No parent imagines ordinary afternoons with their children will someday become treasured memories replayed endlessly in grief. But after Michael vanished, his family would find themselves clinging desperately to the smallest recollections of him. Christopher Byas stood apart from the others immediately. Intense, emotional, and unpredictable, Christopher possessed an energy that adults sometimes found difficult to manage. He loved roughhousing, loved attention, loved proving he was brave or funny or stronger than other kids. His emotions arrived fast and powerfully. If he became angry, everyone knew. If he became excited, the entire room felt it. Some adults described him as difficult, but children often gravitated toward personalities like Christopher's because he made ordinary afternoons feel exciting. He could transform empty lots into battlefields and drainage ditches into adventure zones through sheer force of imagination. Christopher also carried vulnerabilities that many people around him recognized. His family life involved conflict and instability at times, and there were indications he struggled emotionally in ways unusual for someone so young. But he remained deeply attached to his friends, especially during those endless spring afternoons when the three boys rode bicycles through West Memphis together. To them, the town still felt enormous. The woods behind Robin Hood Hills still felt mysterious rather than dangerous. Childhood has a way of making neglected places seem magical. Rusted pipes become hidden tunnels. Muddy ditches become rivers. Abandoned patches of forest become kingdoms beyond adult control. Robin Hood Hills was one of those places. Adults saw mosquitoes, trash, and danger. The boys saw freedom. In many ways, the friendship between Stevie, Michael, and Christopher reflected the strange chemistry common among childhood groups. Stevie provided fearless momentum. Michael brought steadiness. Christopher brought emotional intensity. Together they formed the kind of bond adults sometimes underestimate because it appears ordinary from the outside. But at 8 years old, friendships feel absolute. Friends are not simply companions. They are entire worlds. On school days, the boys moved through classrooms and playgrounds carrying the concerns typical for children their age. Homework mattered. Cartoon shows mattered. Trading cards mattered. Adults discussing jobs, bills, or relationship problems faded into background noise compared to the immediate urgency of childhood life. Yet despite their innocence, these boys were still growing up in West Memphis, surrounded by poverty and adult instability more visible than many communities cared to admit. Children absorb environments differently than adults. They may not fully understand financial hardship or social tension, but they feel stress in raised voices, closed doors, and anxious silence. Many families in West Memphis lived under constant economic strain. Some parents worked exhausting hours for low pay. Others struggled with addiction, unstable relationships, or emotional exhaustion. Children learned independence early because adults often had little choice but to let them roam freely while trying to survive their own problems. The boys' neighborhoods reflected that reality. Streets were lined with modest homes and apartment complexes where bicycles piled beside porches and dogs barked behind fences. Summer heat settled heavily over the pavement. Teenagers wandered parking lots listening to music from cheap car stereos. The smell of cigarettes drifted from open windows while televisions glowed inside darkened living rooms. It was not a perfect environment, but it was home. And within that imperfect world, the boys built routines that felt safe to them. One of the haunting aspects of this case is how normal the final day began. May 5, 1993 was not marked by obvious warning signs or dramatic tension. The boys attended school. They talked with friends. They moved through ordinary childhood routines, completely unaware that history had already attached itself to that date forever. The weather carried the sticky warmth of southern spring. The afternoon unfolded slowly like countless afternoons before it. Parents handled chores and errands while children drifted outdoors searching for adventure. Somewhere in the background, lawnmowers hummed. Dogs barked. Car engines rolled down neighborhood streets. Nothing about the day itself seemed extraordinary. Stevie spent time around his neighborhood before eventually meeting with Michael and Christopher. Like most children their age, they moved between homes fluidly, rarely informing adults exactly where they planned to go. The freedom of childhood in the early 1990s now feels almost shocking compared to modern parenting culture. Kids disappeared for hours with little supervision, especially in working-class communities where parents juggled jobs and responsibilities. As long as children returned before dark, most adults assumed everything was fine. The boys had likely explored Robin Hood Hills many times before. The woods represented adventure, secrecy, and escape from boredom. They could ride trails, climb embankments, and imagine themselves far from adult rules despite remaining only minutes away from home. That sense of familiarity would later deepen the horror surrounding the case. This was not some distant wilderness. It was part of their neighborhood. Part of their childhood landscape. At some point that afternoon, the boys rode toward the woods together. Witnesses later recalled seeing them on their bicycles. Their movements through the neighborhood seemed completely unremarkable at the time. 3 boys riding together beneath the fading sunlight was one of the most ordinary sights imaginable in West Memphis. Nobody watching them disappear down the street could have guessed they were seeing the final hours of those children alive. What makes the loss especially painful is the innocence embedded within those final moments. The boys were not rebellious teenagers wandering into obvious danger. They were children chasing another afternoon of exploration before dinner. They trusted the world the way children are supposed to trust it. They believed darkness only existed in movies, stories, or warnings from adults. They did not understand how quickly violence can emerge inside ordinary places. For the families, memory eventually transformed into torture. Parents replayed every interaction from that day repeatedly, searching for missed clues or final signs. Did one of the boys seem frightened? Did they mention someone suspicious? Could anything have been done differently? Grief creates endless questions because accepting randomness feels unbearable. After the murders, ordinary memories became sacred and painful simultaneously. A backpack left beside a bedroom wall. A pair of shoes near the front door. Half-finished homework sitting on a kitchen table. The details children leave behind suddenly became all their families had left to hold on to. In later years, the public discussion surrounding the West Memphis 3 often focused so heavily on the accused teenagers that the victims themselves faded into the background. Documentaries dissected police mistakes. Lawyers debated forensic evidence. Activists argued over wrongful convictions. Yet behind all those arguments remained 3 children frozen forever at 8 years old. Their lives stopped before adolescence, before adulthood, before they ever had the chance to become more complicated than neighborhood boys riding bicycles together through a poor Arkansas town. The emotional tragedy of the case lies partly in that stolen future. Stevie would never outgrow his recklessness into maturity. Michael would never discover who he might become as an adult. Christopher would never channel his intensity into something larger than childhood chaos. Their personalities remain preserved only through fragmented memories from grieving families and old photographs faded with time. Looking back now, there is something deeply unsettling about how ordinary their world appeared before violence entered it. No dramatic foreshadowing warned the town what was coming. The boys laughed, argued, explored, and played exactly as children always have. The normalcy of their lives makes the horror more difficult to process because it destroys the comforting illusion that terrible things announce themselves beforehand. Sometimes evil arrives quietly into completely ordinary afternoons. By the evening of May 5th, the boys had still not returned home. At first, adults assumed they were simply late. Children lose track of time. Bikes break down. Friends wander farther than expected. But as daylight faded and shadows stretched across West Memphis, concern slowly transformed into panic. Parents stepped onto porches scanning empty streets. Family members began calling neighbors. The ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood shifted subtly as adults realized something was wrong. Somewhere beyond the streets and houses of West Memphis, 3 children who should have been heading home for dinner were already moving toward a fate that would scar the town forever. The evening of May 5, 1993 began slipping into darkness slowly, almost gently, as if the town itself did not yet understand what was unfolding beneath the trees at Robin Hood Hills. The spring air hung thick with humidity, wrapping West Memphis in the heavy warmth that settled over Arkansas long before summer officially arrived. Streetlights blinked awake one by one along residential roads while televisions glowed behind thin curtains and screen doors. Somewhere, lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically across dry grass. Somewhere else, a radio played country music through an open garage. The world still felt ordinary. But inside several homes across West Memphis, mothers had begun looking at clocks more often than usual. Children were supposed to come home before dark. That was the rule. And darkness was arriving quickly. At first, nobody panicked. 8-year-old boys lost track of time constantly. One friend's backyard turned into another friend's driveway, then into a ride down the block, then into another are gone without warning. Parents in working-class neighborhoods learned to tolerate that uncertainty because children spent so much of their lives outdoors. But as daylight thinned into dusk, concern began spreading quietly between households. Pam Hicks stepped onto her porch searching the street for Stevie's bicycle. The neighborhood looked strangely still. A dog barked somewhere nearby. A truck rolled slowly past the intersection. But no sign of Stevie. She called his name once into the warm evening air, expecting the familiar sound of him answering from somewhere down the block. Nothing came back except silence and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. In another home, Michael Moore's family was beginning to worry too. Michael was dependable compared to many children his age. If he said he would be home, he usually was. As the minutes dragged forward, the anxiety deepened. Christopher Bias' family experienced the same growing fear. The 3 boys were often together, which meant if one was missing, likely all 3 were missing. That realization settled heavily over the adults as the sky darkened from orange to deep blue. Telephones began ringing between neighbors. Have you seen them? Were they at your house? Did anyone check the woods? The search started informally at first. Parents climbed into cars and drove familiar streets slowly, scanning sidewalks and empty lots. Others walked through nearby neighborhoods shouting the boys' names. Flashlights cut through gathering darkness while mosquitoes swarmed around faces and bare arms. The atmosphere shifted with every passing minute. Fear spreads physically through groups of people. Voices tighten. Movements quicken. Conversations shorten into sharp questions and incomplete sentences. By full dark, the neighborhood no longer felt ordinary at all. It felt wrong. Robin Hood Hills loomed at the edge of that fear like a dark mouth opening into the earth. During daylight, the woods looked unimpressive and familiar. At night, they became something entirely different. The trees blocked what little moonlight reached the ground. Muddy water reflected faint streaks of silver beneath tangled branches. The narrow trails twisting through the woods seemed to disappear after only a few feet. Searchers entering the area felt immediate unease, though few could explain why. Maybe it was simply instinct. Humans know when places feel unsafe. Volunteers moved carefully through the woods carrying weak flashlights that illuminated only fragments of terrain at a time. Wet leaves. Broken branches. Mosquitoes thick in the air. Water moving sluggishly through drainage ditches. The smell of mud and stagnant water clung to everything. Parents called out the boys' names repeatedly, their voices cracking with desperation. Stevie. Michael. Christopher. The woods answered only with insects and distant frogs. Some searchers believed the boys might simply be hiding, perhaps afraid they were in trouble for staying out too late. Others already feared something far worse. Police officers joined the search as concern escalated rapidly. Missing children cases always carry urgency, but 3 missing boys together triggered immediate alarm. Patrol cars rolled through neighborhoods while officers questioned residents. Flashlights swept beneath bridges and through empty lots. Yet despite the growing number of people searching, nobody found the boys that night. And somewhere inside Robin Hood Hills, hidden beneath darkness and shallow water, the truth waited silently. Later investigations would spend years trying to reconstruct exactly what happened during those missing hours. But certainty never fully emerged. The timeline dissolved into fragments of witness sightings, conflicting statements, and unanswered questions. What remains most terrifying is the possibility that the boys likely entered the woods without fear. They probably expected another ordinary adventure. Perhaps they joked with each other while riding bicycles down the dirt paths. Perhaps they argued about something meaningless the way children always do. Maybe they planned to return home within minutes. Whatever happened next shattered those expectations forever. There are moments in certain crimes where violence seems to rupture reality itself. The West Memphis murders carried that feeling from the very beginning because of the victims' ages and the brutality involved. Whoever encountered the boys in Robin Hood Hills did not merely kill them. The crime scene would later suggest fear, confusion, and prolonged suffering. One of the most horrifying aspects of child murder cases is the complete imbalance of power involved. Children trust adults instinctively. Even when frightened, they often obey instructions because they still believe older people control the world safely. That innocence makes violence against them feel uniquely monstrous. As night deepened across West Memphis, parents refused to stop searching. Groups gathered near the woods coordinating efforts beneath dim streetlights. Some volunteers carried hunting flashlights and walked shoulder to shoulder through muddy terrain. Others checked drainage pipes, abandoned buildings, and nearby roads. Every passing hour made the atmosphere heavier. People began imagining terrible possibilities they were afraid to say aloud. Accidents, kidnapping, violence. In small towns, fear spreads collectively. Entire neighborhoods start breathing with the same anxious rhythm. Inside homes across West Memphis, televisions remained on late into the night while residents waited for updates. Children sensed adult panic and stayed unusually quiet. Some mothers locked doors earlier than normal. Fathers stood outside smoking cigarettes in tense silence. Nobody slept comfortably. By midnight, the disappearance no longer felt temporary. Something terrible had happened. Yet even then, nobody could imagine the scale of horror waiting beneath the surface of Robin Hood Hills. The next morning arrived grey and damp. Search efforts resumed immediately. Volunteers returned to the woods exhausted from the previous night but unwilling to stop. Police continued canvassing neighborhoods while families clung desperately to hope. Children disappear and survive sometimes. They get lost. They wander farther than intended. They hide. Every parent involved in the search fought internally against darker thoughts. Hope becomes a survival mechanism during moments like that. Without it, panic consumes everything. Shortly after noon on May 6, Juvenile Probation Officer Steve Jones entered Robin Hood Hills after reports that bicycles belonging to the missing boys had been found near the woods. The discovery immediately intensified concern. The bikes were abandoned near the edge of the wooded area, tangled together unnaturally as though dropped suddenly. For parents and investigators alike, the sight felt deeply wrong. Children do not leave bicycles behind willingly. Jones moved deeper into the woods toward a muddy drainage ditch partially hidden beneath thick brush. The water there appeared dark and still beneath low-hanging branches. Then he saw a shoe floating near the surface. At first glance, the ditch revealed little. Muddy water concealed almost everything beneath it. But as Jones looked closer, shapes began emerging from the darkness below. Human forms. Small forms. The bodies of 3 boys lay submerged in the ditch, hidden beneath water and tangled branches. Even experienced investigators later described the scene as horrifying beyond words. The children had been stripped naked. Their wrists and ankles were bound together with shoelaces. Mud coated their skin and hair. The shallow water surrounding them reflected broken fragments of sunlight through the trees overhead, creating a surreal stillness that many people at the scene never forgot. For several seconds, nobody moved. The reality of what they were seeing seemed too impossible to process. Then chaos erupted. Officers secured the area while word spread rapidly through the search teams. Parents waiting nearby sensed immediately from police reactions that hope had vanished. Some collapsed. Others screamed. The emotional devastation moved through Robin Hood Hills like a physical shockwave. The murders instantly transformed West Memphis from a worried town into a traumatized one. Detectives arriving at the scene confronted details that deepened the horror further. The bindings on the boys appeared deliberate and methodical. Christopher Bias had suffered severe injuries that investigators struggled to explain immediately. Rumors began almost instantly among law enforcement personnel that the murders carried signs of ritualistic violence. Those rumors would later grow into full-blown theories about satanic sacrifice, but even in those first hours, the crime scene seemed strange enough to fuel speculation. The woods themselves amplified the nightmare quality of the discovery. Sunlight barely reached portions of the ditch through dense branches overhead. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly around investigators. Mud sucked at boots with every step. The smell of stagnant water mixed with decay hung heavily in the humid air. Officers photographed the scene while struggling emotionally to process what they were witnessing. Some became physically sick afterward. Child homicide scenes affect even hardened investigators differently. The innocence of the victims changes everything. News spread through West Memphis with terrifying speed. Before official announcements were even completed, residents already whispered about bodies found in the woods. Television crews began arriving. Police scanners crackled constantly. Church groups organized prayer circles almost immediately. Fear gripped parents throughout the community. Children were pulled indoors. Schools buzzed with confusion and anxiety. Adults lowered their voices when discussing the murders, as though speaking too loudly might somehow make the horror more real. The discovery of the bodies marked the moment when the case stopped being merely tragic and became something darker in the public imagination. The bindings, the wooded location, and the injuries created an atmosphere ripe for speculation. Investigators faced enormous pressure to explain not only who committed the crime, but why it looked so disturbing. Human beings struggle deeply with unexplained violence against children because it violates fundamental assumptions about safety and morality. Communities desperately search for meaning after crimes like this. Random cruelty feels psychologically unbearable. People want monsters they can identify clearly. They want evil to look recognizable. And in West Memphis, the search for recognizable evil would soon focus on teenagers who already frightened the town long before the murders occurred. But during those first hours after the bodies were found, the town existed in pure shock. Families gathered around televisions watching breaking news reports. Children asked frightened questions adults could barely answer themselves. Police officers worked frantically behind yellow crime scene tape while helicopters circled overhead. Robin Hood Hills became transformed overnight from an ordinary patch of woods into sacred ground soaked with grief and fear. The boys who had entered those woods expecting adventure would leave them carried in body bags beneath the horrified gaze of an entire community. And as investigators searched desperately for answers, something else was already beginning to spread through West Memphis alongside grief. Suspicion. Rumors. Panic. The need to explain unimaginable violence through equally unimaginable evil. Within days, that fear would begin pointing toward specific names. But on May 6, 1993, before the trials and accusations and documentaries, there was only devastation. 3 children were dead. Their families stood shattered beyond repair. And somewhere beyond the edges of Robin Hood Hills, the person responsible was still free. By the afternoon of May 6, 1993, Robin Hood Hills no longer belonged to children. The woods had become a crime scene, sealed behind yellow tape and guarded by police officers whose faces already carried the exhausted, hollow look of people exposed to something deeply disturbing. The muddy trails where boys once raced bicycles now filled with investigators stepping carefully through stagnant water and tangled brush. News vans gathered near the entrance to the wooded area while reporters rehearsed sentences heavy with shock and disbelief. The entire town of West Memphis seemed to hold its breath at once, waiting for answers nobody yet possessed. Inside the woods, investigators moved through the scene with growing unease. Even before autopsies were completed, the condition of the bodies immediately shaped the direction of the investigation. The boys had been found submerged in shallow muddy water, their naked bodies bound hand to foot with shoelaces. The bindings appeared intentional and strangely methodical. One child, Christopher Bias, showed severe injuries far more graphic than those suffered by the other two boys. Detectives struggled to interpret exactly what they were seeing. In violent crimes, uncertainty creates dangerous space for imagination, and imagination was already beginning to take control. The woods themselves seemed to intensify every dark theory emerging from the investigation. Robin Hood Hills felt isolated despite sitting close to residential neighborhoods. Thick brush muffled outside sound. Water pooled silently beneath low branches. Even during daylight, certain areas appeared dim and claustrophobic. Officers working the scene later described the oppressive atmosphere inside the woods, the constant mosquitoes, the mud sucking at their boots, the smell of stagnant water hanging beneath the humid Arkansas heat. It was the kind of environment where fear grows quickly. Every broken branch looked suspicious. Every shadow seemed significant. Detectives searched the area obsessively for signs of struggle, footprints, discarded clothing, weapons, anything capable of identifying who had brought the boys into the woods and murdered them. Yet the crime scene presented immediate problems. The ditch water had contaminated potential evidence. Search volunteers had unknowingly moved through portions of the area before the bodies were discovered. Rain and mud complicated forensic analysis. Investigators found few clear answers during those first crucial hours. Instead, they encountered fragments. Pieces of clothing submerged in water. The boys' bicycles abandoned near the woods. Shoelaces used as bindings. Disturbing injuries that seemed to suggest rage, ritual, or both. Without a clear suspect, detectives began constructing theories. And almost immediately, those theories drifted toward the occult. The early 1990s represented the peak of America's satanic panic, a cultural wave of fear convincing millions of people that hidden cults operated across the country committing ritual abuse and murder. Police departments attended seminars teaching officers how to recognize occult crime scenes. Self-proclaimed experts lectured investigators about satanic symbols, ceremonial killings, and underground networks supposedly hiding in plain sight. Many of these theories lacked credible evidence, but fear rarely waits for proof. In communities already steeped in religious anxiety, satanic explanations often felt emotionally satisfying because they transformed random horror into identifiable evil. West Memphis was fertile ground for those fears. As investigators examined the scene at Robin Hood Hills, the possibility of ritualistic violence quickly entered conversation. Christopher Bias injuries especially fueled speculation. Some officers believed the mutilation suggested ceremonial intent rather than ordinary homicide. Others became convinced the bindings resembled ritual practices described in occult crime seminars. Once those ideas surfaced, they spread rapidly through the department and into the community itself. Soon whispers of Satan worship began moving through West Memphis like wildfire. At grocery stores, church gatherings, and school hallways, residents repeated frightening rumors with growing certainty. People spoke about black robes, animal sacrifices, graveyard rituals, and devil worshippers hiding among local teenagers. Fear transformed ordinary gossip into perceived truth almost overnight. The murders no longer felt like the work of a single violent individual. To many residents, they became evidence of something larger and more terrifying infecting the town itself. Investigators faced overwhelming pressure from every direction. 3 murdered children demanded immediate justice. Media attention intensified daily. Grieving families pleaded publicly for answers. Community panic escalated with each passing hour. In cases involving child victims, police departments often feel enormous emotional urgency to identify suspects quickly. Nobody wanted West Memphis believing a child killer still roamed free. Yet urgency can distort investigations, especially when detectives begin searching for theories instead of evidence. The first major clues appeared frustratingly weak. Witnesses reported seeing suspicious individuals near Robin Hood Hills around the time of the murders, but descriptions varied wildly. Some mentioned teenagers wearing dark clothing. Others described older men. Several statements contradicted each other completely. Rumors quickly overwhelmed facts. Every strange person in town suddenly became suspicious. Police interviewed dozens of individuals during those early days, chasing leads that often dissolved almost immediately. Meanwhile, the autopsies deepened both horror and confusion. Medical examiners determined the boys had drowned after sustaining injuries, though debate would continue for years regarding the exact sequence of events. The bindings remained central to the investigation because they seemed deliberate and symbolic. Christopher Bias wounds especially disturbed investigators. Some interpreted them as evidence of torture or ritual mutilation. Others believed the injuries could have resulted from animal predation after death. But in the emotional atmosphere surrounding the case, the darkest explanations gained traction fastest. Fear prefers dramatic answers. Soon investigators began focusing increasingly on local teenagers known for unusual behavior or interests in the occult. And one name surfaced repeatedly: Damien Eccles. Damien already carried a reputation throughout West Memphis as troubled and dangerous. He wore black clothing constantly, listened to heavy metal music, read books about witchcraft and spirituality, and spoke openly about occult subjects in ways that deeply unsettled conservative adults. Police officers knew him from previous encounters involving minor disturbances and mental health concerns. Teachers described him as intelligent but unstable. Neighbors whispered stories portraying him almost like a supernatural threat. Some claimed he drank blood during rituals. Others insisted he sacrificed animals in the woods. Very little of it could be verified, but verification mattered less and less as fear consumed the town. Damien fit the image people wanted to fear. Thin, pale, intense, and openly fascinated by dark subjects, he appeared almost designed by cultural paranoia itself. In another environment, he might have been dismissed as a rebellious teenager searching for identity. In West Memphis during the Satanic Panic, he looked like exactly the kind of person capable of ritual murder. Detectives began paying closer attention to him almost immediately, though concrete evidence remained painfully absent. The investigation increasingly blurred the line between criminal evidence and moral judgment. Officers questioned teenagers about heavy metal music, black clothing, occult books, and cemetery gatherings as though alternative interests themselves indicated violent tendencies. Rumors became investigative fuel. Parents warned police about weird kids hanging around town. Church leaders spoke publicly about spiritual warfare. The atmosphere grew so emotionally charged that objective analysis became difficult. Even experienced investigators can fall prey to confirmation bias when community fear aligns perfectly with existing cultural narratives. The murders seemed too horrifying to be random, and Damien Eccles seemed too frightening to ignore. While police focused increasingly on occult theories, other leads received less attention. Some investigators considered the possibility of a local offender with a history of violence. Others examined family members and acquaintances connected to the victims. But none of those avenues generated the emotional certainty surrounding satanic explanations. Human beings often prefer dramatic evil over mundane violence because dramatic evil feels easier to identify and contain. The idea that disturbed teenagers performed ritual murders in the woods offered psychological clarity to a terrified community. It created monsters people believed they could recognize. Meanwhile, national media began descending aggressively on West Memphis. Television crews filmed outside police headquarters. Newspaper headlines emphasized the bizarre and disturbing aspects of the case. The phrase cult killings appeared increasingly often despite limited supporting evidence. Reporters interviewed frightened residents who described satanic activity spreading through the community. Every sensational rumor amplified public panic further. The murders stopped feeling like a local tragedy and started transforming into national spectacle. Behind closed doors, investigators struggled with mounting frustration. Physical evidence remained limited. No murder weapon had been identified. No eyewitness directly connected suspects to the crime scene. Forensic science in the early 1990s lacked many modern capabilities, especially in contaminated outdoor scenes like Robin Hood Hills. Detectives needed breakthroughs quickly, and pressure intensified with every news cycle. Then another critical piece of information emerged. A local woman named Vicky Hutchison contacted police claiming involvement with occult groups and suggesting Damien Eccles participated in ritualistic activities. Her statements dramatically reinforced investigators' growing suspicions. Hutchison later became one of the most controversial figures in the case because of inconsistent accounts and questions surrounding her credibility, but at the time, detectives treated her claims seriously. She described ceremonies, strange gatherings, and behavior that appeared to align perfectly with the satanic narrative already dominating the investigation. Whether consciously or unconsciously, investigators began constructing a story before possessing enough evidence to support it fully. And once narratives take hold during investigations, contradictory information often gets overlooked or minimized. Detectives no longer searched broadly for unknown offenders. Increasingly, they searched for proof confirming suspicions they already held. The crime scene at Robin Hood Hills became interpreted through that lens. The bindings suggested ritual. The injuries suggested sacrifice. The wooded location suggested ceremony. Each assumption reinforced the next until the theory itself began feeling undeniable to many people involved. Public fear intensified to extraordinary levels. Parents throughout West Memphis monitored children constantly. Churches held prayer meetings focused on spiritual evil invading the community. Teenagers who dressed differently found themselves treated with suspicion or outright hostility. Some young people cut their hair or changed clothing styles simply to avoid attention. The murders created a psychological divide between normal residents and anyone perceived as strange. In environments driven by fear, individuality becomes dangerous. Yet despite all the rumors and theories swirling around West Memphis, investigators still lacked definitive evidence. The case remained emotionally explosive but legally fragile. Detectives needed something concrete capable of transforming suspicion into prosecution. They needed witnesses, confessions, or physical proof linking suspects directly to the murders. Without that, the investigation risked collapsing beneath its own speculation. Then attention shifted toward another teenager connected loosely to Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin. A teenager named Jesse Miskelly Jr. quiet, intellectually limited, eager to please authority figures. Detectives believed Jesse might possess information about the murders. What happened next would become one of the most debated interrogations in American criminal history. But before Jesse entered the interrogation room, the investigation had already been shaped profoundly by fear, pressure, and cultural panic. Robin Hood Hills no longer existed merely as a crime scene. It had become a symbol onto which an entire town projected its deepest anxieties about evil, morality, and the changing world around them. And somewhere within that storm of grief and paranoia, the line between truth and assumption was beginning to disappear. In the weeks following the murders, West Memphis became a town trapped inside its own fear. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Robin Hood Hills. Grocery store aisles fell silent when strangers walked past. Church sermons shifted toward warnings about darkness, temptation, and evil hiding among ordinary people. Parents no longer allowed children to roam neighborhoods freely after sunset. Screen doors that once stayed open into the evening now remained locked. Even daylight felt different somehow, as though the murders had drained safety from the town itself. Police pressure intensified daily. 3 murdered children. National media attention. Terrified families demanding justice. Investigators understood that failure to solve the case quickly would destroy public confidence completely. But despite hundreds of interviews and countless rumors, solid evidence remained painfully thin. The crime scene offered horror but not clarity. Physical forensic links to suspects were almost non-existent. Witness statements contradicted one another constantly. The investigation began moving in circles, chasing possibilities that dissolved into nothing. Yet one theory refused to disappear. Satanism. Ritual murder. Occult violence. The idea had infected the case so deeply that many investigators no longer questioned it. They searched for confirmation rather than alternatives. And at the center of that growing suspicion remained Damien Echols. Damien's appearance and behavior made him a perfect target in the cultural atmosphere of 1993 Arkansas. He wore black almost constantly. He read books about magic, religion, and the occult. He listened to heavy metal bands whose lyrics frightened conservative adults. He spoke openly about spiritual subjects in ways that sounded provocative and disturbing. More importantly, he seemed emotionally volatile. Teachers described him as brilliant one moment and deeply unsettling the next. Police officers already viewed him as troubled because of previous encounters involving mental health crises and minor disturbances. In the minds of many people in West Memphis, Damien already looked guilty before any evidence existed. Rumors surrounding him expanded rapidly after the murders. Some residents claimed he participated in animal sacrifices. Others insisted he drank blood or performed rituals in cemeteries. None of these stories could be reliably verified, but fear rarely demands proof. Each rumor reinforced the next until Damien evolved into something almost mythological inside the public imagination. He became the embodiment of every adult fear about rebellious youth culture. Long hair, black clothing, metal music, occult interests. To frightened residents already convinced satanic cults existed, Damien fit perfectly into the role of monster. Investigators interviewed him multiple times. During those conversations, Damien often behaved in ways that only increased suspicion. He spoke casually about occult subjects and sometimes appeared almost amused by the attention surrounding him. Whether this reflected teenage arrogance, emotional instability, or an attempt to appear intellectually superior remains debated even today. But inside police departments already leaning toward satanic theories, his behavior looked sinister. Damien did not present himself like an innocent teenager desperate to avoid suspicion. He projected defiance. In emotionally charged investigations, defiance often gets mistaken for guilt. Yet even as detectives focused heavily on Damien, they still lacked enough evidence to make arrests. The investigation needed something stronger. Something undeniable. That opportunity appeared in June 1993 when police brought in Jesse Miskelly Jr. for questioning. Jesse was fundamentally different from Damien in almost every way. Where Damien appeared intense and confrontational, Jesse seemed passive and eager for approval. He possessed limited intellectual functioning, with reports later placing his IQ around the low 70s. Friends described him as impressionable, the kind of person easily influenced by stronger personalities. He struggled academically and socially throughout much of his life. Detectives believed Jesse might possess information connecting Damien and Jason Baldwin to the murders. On June 3, 1993, Jesse entered the interrogation room without fully understanding how dramatically his life was about to change. The interrogation lasted for hours. Investigators questioned Jesse repeatedly about the murders, pressing him for details, correcting inconsistencies, and guiding conversations back toward their existing theory of the crime. Only a small portion of the questioning was officially recorded. That fact would later become enormously controversial because critics argued the missing hours contained coercion, suggestion, and psychological pressure. Inside the interrogation room, detectives confronted Jesse with accusations and leading questions while attempting to extract a confession. Eventually, Jesse broke. During the recorded portion of the interrogation, he confessed to participating in the murders alongside Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. He described the boys being attacked in Robin Hood Hills and claimed the killings occurred as part of violent abuse involving multiple perpetrators. For investigators desperate for progress, the confession felt like salvation. After weeks of frustration and public pressure, they finally possessed a direct admission connecting suspects to the crime. But almost immediately, serious problems emerged within Jesse's statement. He repeatedly described details that conflicted with known evidence. He initially claimed the murders occurred in the morning rather than evening. Detectives corrected him. He misidentified the manner of attack several times. Detectives redirected him. Portions of the confession seemed less like spontaneous recollection and more like a confused teenager trying desperately to satisfy authority figures demanding specific answers. Yet despite these contradictions, police treated the confession as genuine. Once investigators believe they have secured the truth, they often reinterpret inconsistencies as nervousness or imperfect memory rather than evidence of innocence. The emotional pressure surrounding the case intensified confirmation bias enormously. Detectives no longer questioned whether Damien, Jason, and Jesse committed the murders. They focused entirely on building prosecution around that assumption. News of the confession exploded across West Memphis. For many residents, it confirmed everything they already believed. The satanic rumors, the strange teenagers, the occult theories. Fear hardened suddenly into certainty. Public outrage shifted toward rage. People wanted punishment immediately. Damien Echols especially became a figure of hatred throughout the community. Adults who had once merely viewed him as strange now spoke about him like pure evil wearing human skin. Meanwhile, Jesse quickly began recanting portions of his confession. He insisted investigators pressured him into saying things that were not true. His attorneys argued that his intellectual limitations made him highly vulnerable during interrogation. Critics later pointed out that Jesse appeared confused throughout much of the recorded statement, often guessing at answers or changing details after correction from detectives. But by then, the confession had already transformed public perception permanently. In criminal investigations, confessions carry extraordinary emotional power. People want to believe nobody would admit involvement in child murder unless guilty. The possibility of false confessions, especially from vulnerable individuals under pressure, remains psychologically difficult for many people to accept. Police soon arrested Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. The town reacted with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief because suspects had finally been identified. Horror because the accused were local teenagers many residents already recognized. Television cameras captured images of the three boys being escorted through legal proceedings while reporters described them as members of a satanic cult responsible for ritual child murder. Damien's appearance especially fueled sensational media coverage. Thin, pale, dressed in black, he looked exactly like the kind of suspect tabloids wanted. The narrative practically wrote itself. 3 innocent children sacrificed by devil-worshipping teenagers in the woods of Arkansas. The story spread nationally with terrifying speed. Yet beneath the dramatic headlines, major weaknesses remained in the case. No physical evidence directly linked the teenagers to the murders. No fingerprints connected them to the scene. No blood evidence placed them in Robin Hood Hills during the crime. No murder weapon had been recovered. The prosecution relied heavily on Jesse's confession and the broader theory of occult involvement. But emotionally charged cases often operate differently than ordinary investigations. Once public fear locks onto suspects, absence of evidence can begin feeling irrelevant. Everything about Damien, Jason, and Jesse became reinterpreted through the lens of presumed guilt. Their music preferences seemed suspicious. Their clothing seemed sinister. Their teenage behavior became evidence of moral corruption. The investigation increasingly resembled a cultural judgment as much as a criminal case. Outside the courtroom, West Memphis remained emotionally divided in complicated ways. Some residents quietly questioned the strength of the evidence. Others believed police had rushed toward the first suspects matching community fears. But publicly expressing doubt became difficult. 3 children were dead. Supporting the accused teenagers risked appearing sympathetic toward evil itself. Fear and grief often create environments where skepticism feels dangerous. Families of the victims endured unimaginable emotional devastation while simultaneously becoming entangled in the escalating public drama surrounding the case. Every news report reopened wounds. Every rumor deepened confusion. Instead of receiving space to grieve privately, they watched the murders transform into national spectacle. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the case grew almost unbearable. Prosecutors prepared aggressively for trial while emphasizing the satanic elements of the investigation. Expert witnesses on occult crime entered discussions. Investigators continued framing the murders as ritualistic despite limited concrete evidence supporting organized Satanism. America's broader cultural paranoia about hidden cults shaped nearly every aspect of the prosecution strategy. The teenagers themselves reacted differently to their arrests. Jason Baldwin maintained strong declarations of innocence and reportedly struggled emotionally with the surreal collapse of his life. Friends described him as shocked and terrified. Damien continued projecting a colder, more detached image that prosecutors interpreted as remorselessness. Whether that demeanor reflected genuine emotional numbness, mental health struggles, or simple teenage defensiveness remains impossible to know fully. Jesse fluctuated between confusion, recantation, and emotional exhaustion. As months passed, the investigation attracted increasing national attention because of its bizarre combination of child murder, satanic panic, and controversial evidence. Legal experts quietly began questioning aspects of the case even before trials officially started. How reliable was Jesse's confession? Why did so much of the prosecution focus on occult symbolism instead of forensic proof? Had investigators allowed community fear to shape the direction of the case too heavily? But those questions struggled to compete against the emotional power of the murders themselves. Fear dominated logic. The image of 3 murdered little boys in the woods overshadowed nearly every weakness in the investigation. Looking back years later, what becomes most disturbing about this phase of the case is how thoroughly atmosphere influenced perception. West Memphis did not simply investigate a crime. The town interpreted the crime through pre-existing fears about morality, youth culture, and evil. Damien Echols became dangerous partly because he looked dangerous according to the cultural anxieties of the time. Jess's confession became believable partly because people already wanted confirmation of the satanic narrative. The investigation drifted steadily away from objective uncertainty toward emotional certainty. And once that shift occurred, reversing it became almost impossible. By the time prosecutors finalized charges against the West Memphis Three, much of the community already considered the case solved. The real battle now would move into courtrooms packed with grieving families, frightened residents, reporters, and cameras. A battle not only about guilt or innocence, but about fear itself. By early 1994, the murders in West Memphis had already evolved far beyond a local criminal case. What began in the muddy darkness of Robin Hood Hills now stretched across television screens, newspaper headlines, and courtroom hallways crowded with reporters from around the country. The town itself felt permanently altered, as though fear had soaked into the streets and buildings like floodwater that never fully dried. Every resident carried an opinion about the West Memphis Three. Some spoke about Damien Echols with absolute certainty, describing him as evil incarnate hiding behind black clothes and cold eyes. Others whispered quieter doubts behind closed doors, uneasy about how little physical evidence actually connected the teenagers to the murders. But public emotion no longer moved carefully. It surged violently between outrage, grief, and desperation for closure. The trials approached beneath enormous pressure, and both sides understood the stakes immediately. 3 children were dead. 1 teenager faced the death penalty. And somewhere beneath the noise surrounding the case lingered an uncomfortable question nobody could fully silence. What if the investigation had gone terribly wrong? The first major courtroom proceeding focused on Jesse Misskelley Jr., whose confession remained the emotional center of the prosecution's entire case. Prosecutors believed Jess's statement gave them exactly what they needed, a direct narrative connecting all 3 teenagers to the murders. Yet from the beginning, the defense attacked the confession aggressively. Jess's attorneys argued that investigators manipulated a vulnerable teenager with limited intellectual functioning during hours of coercive interrogation. They emphasized how much of the questioning remained unrecorded and highlighted the many contradictions inside Jess's statement. In court, the recorded confession sounded deeply unsettling. Jesse often appeared confused about basic details. He incorrectly described the time of the murders multiple times. Detectives repeatedly corrected him throughout the interview. Certain facts he provided conflicted directly with physical evidence from the crime scene. At moments, it felt less like a confident admission and more like someone trying desperately to satisfy authority figures demanding specific answers. But prosecutors framed those inconsistencies differently. They argued Jesse simply struggled with memory and communication under stress. They insisted the core confession remained truthful despite minor errors. In emotionally charged trials involving murdered children, juries often focus more heavily on emotional narrative than technical inconsistencies. Hearing a teenager calmly describe participating in violence against children carried enormous psychological weight regardless of contradictions. The courtroom atmosphere itself intensified every emotion. Families of the victims sat only feet away from the accused. Reporters scribbled constantly while photographers waited outside for every reaction and expression. The air inside the courtroom often felt thick with grief and tension. Even ordinary sounds seemed amplified. Chairs scraping against the floor. The shuffle of papers. Quiet crying from the gallery. Every person inside understood they were participating in something that had already captured national attention. Jesse himself appeared overwhelmed by the proceedings. He looked frightened, confused, and emotionally exhausted much of the time. His awkward speech patterns and uncertain demeanor created sharply divided interpretations. Some observers saw vulnerability and possible innocence. Others interpreted his behavior as the emptiness of a guilty conscience. Human beings naturally project meaning onto uncertainty, especially in cases already saturated with fear and public opinion. The prosecution leaned heavily into the broader narrative surrounding the murders. Satanism remained central even when direct evidence supporting organized occult ritual stayed weak. Prosecutors introduced testimony about Damien Echols' interest in the occult, heavy metal music, black clothing, and unconventional beliefs. Expert witnesses discussed satanic practices as though explaining the psychology of the crime itself. The implication remained clear throughout the trial. These teenagers belonged to a dark world capable of ritual violence against children. In another era, much of that material might have seemed irrelevant or prejudicial. But in 1994, America still remained deeply influenced by the lingering fear of hidden satanic cults corrupting youth culture. Many adults genuinely believed heavy metal music and occult fascination could lead directly toward violence and moral decay. Prosecutors understood those fears intimately and used them effectively. The defense struggled constantly against emotional momentum already moving strongly toward conviction. They emphasized the absence of physical evidence connecting Jesse to the crime scene. No fingerprints. No blood. No DNA. No eyewitness placing him at Robin Hood Hills during the murders. But absence of evidence often feels abstract compared to the emotional power of murdered children and confessed involvement. The prosecution did not need a perfect case. They needed a believable story. And to many jurors, the confession provided exactly that. In February 1994, Jesse Misskelley Jr. was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree murder. He received a sentence of life imprisonment plus 40 years. The verdict hit West Memphis with strange emotional force. Some residents celebrated openly, believing justice had finally begun. Others felt uneasy watching a vulnerable teenager disappear into prison largely on the strength of a controversial confession. But the case was far from over. Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin still faced trial separately, and the stakes there would become even higher. Prosecutors prepared aggressively for the next phase because Damien especially represented the symbolic center of the entire narrative. To many people, he was not simply a defendant. He was the face of evil they believed had entered West Memphis. During Damien and Jason's trial, the courtroom atmosphere turned even more emotionally charged. Damien's appearance alone carried enormous impact. Thin, pale, dressed in conservative courtroom clothing that could not fully disguise his outsider image, he sat through proceedings with an expression many observers interpreted as cold detachment. Prosecutors used that perception relentlessly. They portrayed Damien as manipulative, violent, and obsessed with death and occult practices. Witnesses testified about statements he allegedly made concerning magic, sacrifice, and violence. Some testimony bordered on rumor more than verified fact, but the cumulative effect proved powerful. Jason Baldwin suffered partly because of his friendship with Damien. Friends and family described Jason as quieter, more ordinary, less provocative. Yet prosecutors argued loyalty connected him deeply to the crimes. Jason's defense emphasized repeatedly that he lacked any history of violence and that no physical evidence tied him to the murders. But by then, the emotional gravity surrounding the case had become almost overwhelming. The courtroom frequently resembled a moral battleground rather than a purely forensic debate. Prosecutors focused heavily on personality, appearance, and cultural symbolism because hard evidence remained limited. One of the most controversial aspects of the trial involved expert testimony about occult crime. Prosecutors introduced individuals claiming expertise in satanic ritual behavior, suggesting the murders reflected ceremonial elements consistent with occult practices. Critics later attacked that testimony as pseudoscientific fear-mongering unsupported by credible evidence. But inside the cultural climate of the early 1990s, such testimony carried significant influence. Jurors already primed by media panic and public fear found the satanic narrative emotionally persuasive even when forensic support remained weak. Meanwhile, defense attorneys attempted desperately to redirect focus toward evidence rather than atmosphere. They challenged inconsistencies in witness statements. They questioned the reliability of Jess's confession. They emphasized again and again that no physical forensic evidence connected Damien or Jason directly to the scene. Yet every argument faced the same underlying obstacle. The murders themselves were so horrifying that many people already believed only monstrous individuals could have committed them. And Damien looked monstrous to a frightened conservative community long before trial ever began. Perhaps the most emotionally devastating moments occurred whenever photographs of the victims appeared in court. The images reminded everyone why the proceedings felt so urgent and painful. 3 children had died violently. Families sat only feet away from the accused while reliving unimaginable trauma through forensic testimony and crime scene descriptions. In cases involving murdered children, emotional neutrality becomes nearly impossible. Jurors are not machines. They absorb grief, fear, and anger whether they intend to or not. Outside the courthouse, media attention intensified constantly. Reporters analyzed Damien's facial expressions, clothing, and behavior almost obsessively. Television coverage framed the case dramatically, often emphasizing the satanic angle because it generated stronger audience reactions. The distinction between legal reality and media spectacle blurred further each day. Supporters of the defendants began organizing more openly as concerns about the evidence spread beyond Arkansas. Some legal observers questioned whether the trials had become contaminated by cultural panic and emotional prejudice. But inside West Memphis itself, public sentiment still leaned heavily toward conviction. People wanted closure. They wanted punishment. They wanted to believe the evil responsible for murdering 3 children had been identified and contained. In March 1994, the verdicts arrived. Jason Baldwin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Damien Echols was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The courtroom reactions reflected both relief and devastation. Families of the victims cried openly. Supporters of the defendants sat stunned in silence. Damien himself appeared emotionally distant as the death sentence was read, though observers would later debate endlessly whether that expression reflected guilt, shock, trauma, or emotional dissociation. With the verdicts finalized, West Memphis officially declared the case solved. 3 teenage killers had been convicted. Justice, according to the legal system, had been delivered. Yet beneath that conclusion, uncertainty still lingered stubbornly. The prosecution had won despite lacking direct physical evidence. The convictions relied heavily on a confession many experts considered questionable and a broader cultural narrative shaped by fear of Satanism. For some observers, the outcome represented necessary justice. For others, it represented a terrifying example of panic overwhelming evidence. In the months following the convictions, life moved forward unevenly for everyone connected to the case. The victims' families attempted to rebuild shattered lives around unbearable loss. Damien entered death row facing the possibility of execution. Jason and Jesse disappeared into prison systems while still barely old enough to understand adulthood. West Memphis itself tried returning to normal, but normal no longer existed. The murders had permanently scarred the town psychologically. Yet even as public attention briefly faded after the convictions, something unexpected was beginning to happen beyond Arkansas. Questions about the case refused to disappear. Journalists, filmmakers, lawyers, and activists started examining the investigation more closely. And the deeper some people looked, the more troubling the entire case began to appear. What prosecutors believed marked the end of the story would eventually become only the beginning of a decades-long battle over truth, justice, and whether 3 teenagers had been condemned not because evidence proved their guilt, but because fear demanded someone to blame. When the courtroom doors finally closed after the convictions, many people in West Memphis believed the nightmare had ended. The killers had been identified. The trials were over. 3 boys were dead, and 3 teenagers had been sentenced for their murders. For the grieving families desperate for answers, the verdicts initially offered something resembling closure, even if that closure remained tangled in pain too deep for language. Newspapers described the case as solved. Television reporters spoke about justice being served. Prosecutors stood before cameras projecting confidence and certainty. Yet beneath the official conclusion, unease lingered like smoke after a fire. The deeper people looked into the case, the more fragile the foundation beneath those convictions began to appear. Damien Echols entered death row at the Arkansas Department of Correction carrying the weight of a death sentence before reaching adulthood. The state intended to kill him. That reality changed everything. Death row stripped life down into routines measured by locked doors, fluorescent lights, and the constant awareness that the government believed you deserved execution. Damien spent years inside cramped prison cells surrounded by concrete and steel, isolated for long periods while appeals moved slowly through the legal system. He read obsessively to survive psychologically. Philosophy, religion, history, poetry. Books became escape routes from the suffocating monotony of incarceration. Yet beneath his intellectual routines remained the constant presence of death itself. Every sound of keys rattling in the hallway reminded inmates what waited at the end of the process. Every execution carried out inside the prison system forced Damien to confront the possibility that someday guards would come for him too. Jason Baldwin disappeared into another kind of prison existence. Unlike Damien, Jason had not received the death penalty, but life without parole still represented a living burial. He entered prison young, frightened, and emotionally shattered by the collapse of his future. Friends later described how deeply prison transformed him. The outside world continued moving while Jason remained frozen inside concrete walls. Birthdays passed. Families aged. Children grew into adults. Entire decades disappeared. Yet despite everything, Jason maintained fierce public declarations of innocence. He refused opportunities to reduce his sentence in exchange for false admissions of guilt because he believed accepting responsibility for murders he did not commit would destroy whatever remained of his identity. Jesse Miskelly Jr. struggled differently. Prison proved especially difficult for someone with his intellectual limitations and emotional vulnerability. Jesse often appeared lost within the system, drifting through years of incarceration while continuing to recount major portions of his confession. His attorneys and supporters argued repeatedly that investigators had manipulated him during interrogation, extracting statements from a confused teenager desperate to satisfy authority figures. Over time, Jesse's confession became one of the most heavily scrutinized aspects of the entire case. Legal experts, psychologists, and journalists dissected the recorded interview repeatedly, pointing toward leading questions, inconsistencies, and signs of coercion. Outside prison walls, the case refused to disappear. Instead, something unexpected happened. A documentary crew led by filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky had been present during portions of the investigation and trial process, initially believing they were documenting the story of obvious child killers. But the deeper they immersed themselves in the case, the more disturbed they became by what they witnessed. The resulting documentary, Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, introduced millions of viewers to details the broader public had never fully considered. The film presented not only the brutality of the murders, but also the troubling weaknesses inside the investigation itself. Viewers watched portions of Jess's confession. They saw the emphasis prosecutors placed on Satanism and appearance rather than forensic evidence. They witnessed how heavily Damien's clothing, music preferences, and personality shaped public perception. For many people outside Arkansas, the documentary created immediate doubt about whether justice had actually been served. The release of Paradise Lost transformed the West Memphis Three from convicted killers into potential victims of wrongful conviction in the eyes of a growing national audience. Support groups formed rapidly. Journalists revisited the evidence. Lawyers volunteered assistance. Celebrities became involved. What made the case uniquely compelling was its emotional complexity. 3 children had unquestionably been murdered in horrifying fashion. The grief of their families remained painfully real. Yet increasing numbers of people began believing the wrong teenagers had been sent to prison because fear and cultural panic overwhelmed objective evidence. The case became symbolic of something larger than a single crime. It became a national argument about the justice system itself. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, new scrutiny exposed additional weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Forensic experts re-examined evidence from Robin Hood Hills using improved scientific techniques unavailable during the original trials. Critics challenged the so-called occult crime testimony presented by prosecutors, arguing much of it resembled pseudoscience rooted in satanic panic hysteria rather than legitimate criminal analysis. The absence of physical evidence linking Damien, Jason, or Jesse to the murders grew increasingly difficult to ignore. No